Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening to take a look at how levels of development can change throughout a different geographic area. Okay, whether we're talking about a region, whether we're talking about a country, we're going to talk about why that may happen, and we're also going to look at some of the effects of its happening. So let's take a look. We start out with different areas where there are variations in levels of development. And so we start out with different regions. For example, you can see the image in the bottom right corner there of the Korean Peninsula. And this is a good example of remote sensing, using some kind of long distance method to take a photograph or some other kind of analysis of an area. And so in this case, it allows us to see the effect of the divide between North and South Korea. The South is significantly more developed than the North is, as we can see from the image. And so as we go through these other examples, I want you to identify which ones are more developed, which ones are less developed. So for example, you see Europe there, East and West. Which one is more developed, East or West? Which one's less developed? In Africa, the extreme north and south. So now we're starting to get a little bit more detailed than we've been in the past, because in the past we've just said that sub-Saharan Africa is less developed. But now we're actually pointing out that the extreme north, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, are significantly more developed. In the extreme south, South Africa, for example, are more developed than the interior part of the country. And so that's important because we're pointing out variations here. Now, within a country is kind of an interesting example. And we're going to look at a couple examples here on the next few slides. So I want you to think about this. And on the next few slides, we're going to look at Mexico, we're going to look at China, we're going to look at Brazil. So I want you guys to think, are there variations of levels of development in the United States? Are there regions of the United States that are more developed? And are there regions that are less developed? How might we evaluate that? How might we measure that? What does that mean for the people living there? Those are really good questions. So I want you to think about that. I want you to come up with a brainstorm. What are some of the regions that you think more developed, less developed within the United States? And then we'll move on. So let's go ahead and start with Brazil. The first question that we want to go ahead and ask on this are our usual questions. What type of map are we looking at? And at what scale are we analyzing this? So hopefully you notice that this is a Corpus map and at the subnational scale. Now, if you happen to know what the subnational units in Brazil are called, then you could say that. In Brazil, just like in the United States, their subnational units are called states as well. So this is the state scale in Brazil. But to avoid any confusion, we might want to go ahead and say subnational scale. And this is looking at each state's per capita GDP as a percentage of the national average. So what is the national average GDP per capita, and then what is the states? And essentially what we know is that the coastal areas, the more urban areas, have a much higher GDP per capita compared to the national average. So they're the ones bringing the national average up, whereas the interior, more rural parts of the country are less so. Now, are there exceptions? Sure, and we definitely want to point those out. The southern part of the country, generally speaking, has a higher percentage of GDP. If we take a look where the capital city of Brasilia is, a very high GDP per capita as a percentage of the national average. Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. And when we take a look at that, we're seeing higher GDP per capita. And so those are some of the things that hopefully we notice on this. When we take a look at China, once again, let's ask the question, what type of map are we looking at? What scale are we analyzing this? And once again, it is a Corpus map, subnational scale. In this case, China's subnational units are generally provinces. All right. They also have autonomous regions and things like that, so they have some more elements to it. But generally speaking, provinces would be sufficient here. And once again, what do we notice? Where are the areas where the GDP per capita is a higher percentage than the national average? And once again, we're noticing that the more urban areas where the big cities are, the coastal areas are the areas with the higher GDP per capita as a percentage of the national average. Now, the question that I want to pose to this, hey, and you could do this for Brazil on the previous slide, you could do it for China on this slide, Mexico on the next slide. The question is, why? What are some of your predictions as to why these areas are more developed? And does that influence your prediction for the United States back on the first slide? Does that influence your predictions about what areas of the country you think will be more developed? What areas of the country will be less developed? So why do you think this is? On our final example, once again, we're asking what type of map, what scale, and just like the previous two maps, it is a choropleth map, subnational scale. Again, like with Brazil, like with the United States, Mexico's subnational units are states. And so we're looking at the state scale, but again, to avoid confusion, we may just want to say subnational scale, all right? And in this case, we ask the question, what areas appear to have a higher GDP per capita as a percentage of the national average? And if you notice, the northern states along the US-Mexico border are states that have a higher GDP per capita. If you take a look at the Yucatan Peninsula, we have a higher GDP per capita. Okay, and so the question that we have is, well, why? Why do you think the Yucatan Peninsula has a higher GDP per capita as a percentage of the national average? Notice Mexico City, which is the federal district that you see there towards the center of the country. Mexico City has a higher GDP per capita, very urban area. And then the northern states, what could explain that? Because it's probably not tourism like in the Yucatan Peninsula. We don't see the very large urban areas like we do with Mexico City in the federal district. So what's happening there in northern Mexico? Why do we see higher GDP per capita there and using that as an indicator of level of development? Well, let's look at that a little bit closer. Because when we take a look at northern Mexico, one of the things that we see is that these are where maquiladoras are located. Okay, these are factories that were built by the United States and by U.S. companies in Mexico, in particular northern Mexico, very close to the border. Now, a couple of things that are associated with this. They tend to be located near major cities or major points of entry into the United States in order to try and reduce the cost of transportation. Now, they originally had to be built within 35 miles of the US-Mexico border, but that restriction, as you can see from the graduated symbol map that we're looking at, has been lifted because we can see them moving a little bit further south. We see very large maquiladora numbers in Monterrey, for example. And the biggest reason why they locate close to the border is to reduce the cost of transportation. But the reason that they were built in Mexico is for the low wage work. All right. So jobs that require a lot of money tied up in labor, what we call labor intensive jobs. It's one of our vocabulary terms. Hey, with a small increase in wages, those companies might decide to find work elsewhere, workers elsewhere that might make a little bit less. And so these factories are actually foreign owned and typically foreign managed companies and factories with Mexican workers. And so typically the raw materials are imported into these factories and then exported back out. So really the only thing that they're using from Mexico is typically the labor. So they're not using Mexican materials. They're not being sold in Mexico typically. They are just being manufactured there. And so generally speaking, it's a mutually beneficial situation because the workers, the Mexican workers working in these maquiladoras, are earning higher wages than they otherwise would, but the factories are paying lower wages than they otherwise would. But as with everything, it's not always perfect for everyone, right? If it works for the Mexican workers and it works for the factory owners, who might not like this situation? Who might stand to lose from this situation? And that's really important to understand because even though we say that it's mutually beneficial, okay, it works for the Mexican workers, it works for the US companies that own and operate it, but who might stand to lose from this? And hopefully you thought, well, what about American workers? Because a lot of times as those wages go up, those jobs are outsourced to other companies, especially if they are labor intensive with a lot of the cost tied up in manufacturing and paying workers. And it really kind of depends on what resource you're talking about. Because is this something that requires skilled labor? Because a lot of times skilled labor has higher wages. Or is it something that is lower skill, less skilled work, and thus would typically be associated with lower wage work? Generally speaking, the jobs that are outsourced to these maquiladoras are lower skill, lower wage work, not higher skill, higher wage work, generally speaking. And maquiladoras are a good example of what we call export processing zones, or EPZs. Export processing zones, it's one of our vocabulary definitions, are zones established by many countries in the periphery and semi-periphery, like Mexico, where they offer favorable tax, regulatory, and trade arrangements to try and attract foreign trade and investment. In this case, maquiladoras are a very good example of an export processing zone in Mexico because they're situated near the border, and so that's going to keep transportation costs down for those companies. Generally speaking, now with NAFTA, they are free of import tariffs, so they're able to import and export goods very, very quickly, free of taxes, and so they're able to take advantage of the lower wage work in Mexico, which in turn in Mexico actually is higher wage work for many of the workers in maquiladoras. So it's improving the level of development in Mexico. That's why those northern states have higher GDPs as a percentage of the national average than do southern states. And it's because of their proximity to the United States and the fact that that keeps transportation costs down. And so this creates an environment where companies who might be looking to go elsewhere are inclined to do that. And so it might be a variety of different things. It might be, areas where transportation costs are very low. For example, the special economic zones in China. Remember, we looked at China just a few minutes ago. The special economic zones are examples of export processing zones, and they're typically situated near major port cities along the coast to keep transportation costs down. And so they create an environment that is inviting for industries around the world who are looking to move someplace else. Because again, remember, according to Weber's least cost theory, they're trying to keep their costs down. Transportation costs, labor costs, and have the benefit of agglomeration. And so in this case, they're clustering in northern Mexico. They are clustering along the coastal parts of China. And they're keeping their labor costs down. They're reducing transportation costs. That's what industries do, according to Weber. And so what ends up happening as a result of this, we've seen countries begin to industrialize and industrialize very rapidly. And as they industrialize, as we have discussed in class, they become more developed. So they are rapidly improving their level of development by industrializing, by creating environments that are inviting to other businesses to bring their industries to Mexico, to China, to Brazil, to India, to Thailand, to Turkey, all these different countries that we're going to be looking at. And so generally speaking, this is just a quick little snapshot here of Mexico as a newly industrialized country. So I want you guys to know that term, newly industrialized country. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as just NIC. All right, newly industrialized countries. So countries that are going through the process of industrialization, countries that are moving forward in their level of development. And so what has helped Mexico to become a newly industrialized country? Again, this is a nice little snapshot for Mexico. And then we would have to tailor it just a little bit to the specific situations in China, in India, in Brazil, and several other countries. All right. But these are some of the reasons why Mexico is industrializing now, is because of those export processing zones that are inviting industries in. The fact that there's very inexpensive labor, something that has been labeled the new international division of labor. The fact that we're seeing periphery and semi-periphery countries offering inexpensive labor, and so that MDCs are bringing those industries to peripheries and semi-periphery countries to work there and then shipping that out. And so now we are dependent on other countries to produce a lot of the goods that we get here in the United States as a product of the international trade approach, which we'll talk about next lecture. So there's kind of a progression with this, that as these countries are becoming more inviting, core countries are bringing those industries there to try and keep their costs down, which is exactly what Weber predicted. So some of the other reasons why Mexico is newly industrializing, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is a big reason why that kept import tariffs down, so that kept costs down for U.S. companies, and that then allowed Mexico to create those export processing zones to invite companies to come there. Weaker environmental regulations, which is going to be cheaper for industries. Tax incentives or no tariffs, keeping those costs down. The fact that they are close to U.S. markets, that's a good example of distance decay. All right, the fact that we're seeing greater cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico is because they're very, very close. And so there's a lot more interaction there. But if it were further away, we might not see the same kind of interaction. Okay? And so we've seen an expanding Mexican middle class, which has then been able to spend more money, which then is then recycled throughout the community, non-basic industries that we talked about last lecture. And so the country is able to industrialize itself as well because there's more money being shifted around in the community. What this is leading to is a shift to the tertiary sector in the United States. So we're seeing fewer jobs in the secondary sector. Those secondary sector jobs are going elsewhere. We're seeing that tourism in Mexico, we talked about the Yucatan Peninsula as a good example of that. It is bringing in money from outside of Mexico, which is allowing it, again, to invest in Mexican infrastructure, invest in Mexican improvements in level of development. That's allowing it to become a newly industrialized country. And so these are all the different things that work in a variety of different ways, and they're kind of going all on at the same time. So there's a lot of moving parts with this to help explain why this is happening in Mexico. So let's take a look at some of the other countries that are labeled newly industrialized countries. And when you take a look at this, again, it's a Corpleth map, national scale. What do you notice about the countries that are labeled? Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, India, China, Malaysia, Thailand, South Africa. What do you notice about them? How would we label them? Are they core, semi-periphery, or periphery? They're almost all semi-periphery. And that is a product of these countries becoming newly industrialized countries. So if we were to modify this map even further, what other countries could we add to this? as newly industrialized countries? What countries do you think would be labeled newly industrialized countries that aren't included on this map? We know that the core countries are already industrialized. They're moving beyond that. They're moving into the tertiary sector. They're post-industrial. So those industrial jobs have to go somewhere. There still has to be manufacturing of raw materials taking place. So these countries are filling that gap as newly industrialized countries. Now, as these countries become more developed, as they move more into the tertiary sector, where then do you think those industrial jobs will go? What countries in another generation will be labeled newly industrialized countries? Are we seeing the progression that takes place as countries become more developed and the effect that it has? Hopefully so. Now, we mentioned this on the previous slide, and we mentioned the International Division of Labor. And so here's our definition and kind of what it looks like. The International Division of Labor, also known as the Global Division of Labor, is the reorganization and relocation of economic activities from a national to a global scale. So generally what we are seeing is that no longer do countries have to produce everything that is going to be consumed in that country. Do we have to produce every piece of clothing, every piece of food that we in the United States consume? Well, no. We can rely on other countries to do that. And so what ends up happening, these are some of the things that go along with this. Okay, the fact that MDCs are going to become more dependent on low-cost goods from LDCs. We're starting to see greater space-time compression, that is leading to areas producing something and then being consumed someplace else. And the fact that we can do that and rely on it, and that it is cheaper to do, because in the past, that wouldn't have been the case. It still would have been too expensive to transport things. And now we're starting to see that those costs are being kept down, which allows companies to look elsewhere to try and reduce those costs, which then those reduced costs are passed on to us, the consumers. So there's a lot of different things happening with this. We're seeing greater trade agreements. NAFTA is a good example. There was the discussion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership with the United States and much of East and Southeast Asia. Doesn't appear to be moving forward anymore. But is that possible in the future? Is some other trade arrangement as this International Division of Labor becomes more solidified? And that's a good question. We are projecting out to the future, and we don't know what that future holds. But it's interesting to kind of look at. Now, this is really, really important. These are the effects of that International Division of Labor. I just abbreviated IDLE up there. These are some of the effects that throughout the course of the year we have been talking about. All right, that in the United States, because we're seeing jobs shift more to LDCs in the secondary sector, that means that there is a level of unemployment in, for example, the United States and other core countries. As a product of deindustrialization, which we'll talk about in the next slide. We're seeing an increase in tertiary sector activities, which might be full-time, it might be part-time. We're seeing internal migration, which we'll see a little bit more evidently on the next couple of slides. With deindustrialization, people are moving where those jobs end up going. And then we're also seeing a decline in the influence of unions. In the past, those unions have been very, very strong. But because companies can say, well, we'll just take those jobs to Mexico, unions are losing some of the bargaining power that in the past they've had. And so those are some of the effects that are happening in the United States and to a certain extent other core countries as well. But for those LDCs, those developing countries, those semi-periphery countries, those newly industrialized countries, where these jobs are going, we're seeing more job opportunities. We're seeing improved gender equality. And remember, with improve gender equality. Typically, that is associated with higher levels of development. They were becoming more developed. Now, to a certain extent, not all of these changes are positive for the developing countries, because as you can see there, an increase in child labor. As the demand for workers increases, there is the potential for the abuse of that in the case of child labor. Hey, not always, but if part of those export processing zones are weaker restrictions on labor laws, then that in theory could lead to that. As well as neocolonialism, which is one of our vocabulary terms, the definition being the entrenchment of the colonial order, such as trade and investment, under a new guise. Now, we've mentioned this back in political geography when we talked about colonialism. We did mention neocolonialism, the new version of colonialism, that LDCs are dependent on MDCs for consumption. Hey, think of maquiladoras as an example. Hey, those products are not being consumed in Mexico. They're being consumed in the United States. They're being consumed in core countries. And so they are very much dependent on the consumption of core countries. Now, what happens if that consumption falls off? Well, that could really hurt the level of development and the income and GDP, GNI of those newly industrialized countries, of those semi-periphery countries, of those countries where we're seeing this new international division of labor develop. We're seeing an increase in the wage gap. We're seeing migration to those manufacturing areas. So we've seen a lot of migration to northern Mexico, for example. We're seeing environmental problems, health problems that might develop as a result. Hey, when we take a look at the total output of fossil fuels, for example, in China, that is something that has been alarmingly high in China. And just very recently, they've said that they're going to attempt to try and cap that and reduce their emissions. But what might have invited companies there were fewer environmental restrictions as part of those export processing zones. So there's a lot of different elements that come into play here. But one that I want to look at is the impact in core countries and, for example, the United States. So to end tonight's lecture, we're going to look at that topic that we mentioned on the last slide, and that was deindustrialization. Now, we have already defined deindustrialization is the shifting of industrial jobs elsewhere. So losing secondary sector jobs, a period of high unemployment, and then an eventual shift into the tertiary sector. So the example that we see here is the Rust Belt. And so the image that you see over on the right side of the screen is the area labeled as the Rust Belt. And it kind of extends from, middle of New York and Pennsylvania through Ohio, much of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, parts of Illinois, and Wisconsin. Right? And the Rust Belt is an area where we saw a lot of manufacturing of metals, like Pittsburgh and steel, and automobiles. And we tend to think of Detroit. And so I'm going to talk about automobiles as an example, because in Detroit, the automobile industry, with the rise of labor unions in the early part of the 20th century and into the mid part of the 20th century, the United Auto Workers Union was very, very, very powerful, and sought to improve working conditions for auto workers, in particular in Detroit and other areas as well. And what ended up happening is that many of the companies where those auto workers were working, they ended up going bankrupt. We talked about them in the early part of the 2000s going bankrupt and having to be bailed out by the U.S. government. Now, there's probably a lot more to it beyond just the labor unions, but we did talk about on the last slide the decline in the influence of labor unions, because as those companies went bankrupt, they sought to move elsewhere. And so a lot of the automobile industry left the Rust Belt and moved to other places. And so that left a huge period of unemployment in the Rust Belt, in the secondary sector, and forced a transition into the tertiary sector. And so there's some elements of that, but let's take a look spatially at what we're talking about. This was a couple of maps that were used as FRQs on the AP Human Geography exam looking at automobile manufacturing plants in the United States. Okay, both domestically owned, those are the light gray, and foreign owned, those are the black. And so we've got a graduated symbol map. That's also to a certain element dot distribution because it's in the specific place data that we're looking at. Okay? And so the top one is looking at 1986, prior to 1986. And we see that most of the automobile manufacturing taking place in the United States was taking place in the Rust Belt. But from 1986 to 2006, we saw a lot of those automobile manufacturing plants move south. Part of it is because of the very high labor costs in the Rust Belt. Okay? And that was a product of the very successful movement of unions like the United Auto Workers Union. But because of those high labor costs, those companies, because Weber's industrial location theory still applies, they're trying to reduce their labor costs. And so they moved where the labor costs are lower. And so they moved into the South where those labor costs were lower. Now, notice that it's still largely clustered on the East Coast because they're trying to keep those transportation costs down and things like that. Notice the increase in foreign-owned automobile manufacturing plants, all right? Because automobiles, are they a bulk gaining or bulk reducing industry? Well, they're bulk gaining. And so if they're bulk gaining, they're going to locate closer to the raw materials or the market. Well, they're going to locate closer to the market. So we saw an increase in foreign-owned automobile manufacturing plants because they're trying to reduce those transportation costs because that's what Weber said. So that's where I leave you today. Now, the next time we're going to look at this are the development strategies that countries could pursue to try and improve their level of development. I'll see you guys in class. Have a wonderful evening.